Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Confabulating. We are delighted to be joined this evening by Dr. Kerstin Mayerhofer of the University of Vienna, who will be delivering a talk entitled Demystifying Jewish Male Menstruation. Kerstin holds a PhD from the University of Vienna. Kerstin's thesis, Jewish Male Menstruation, investigates the use of menstruation in medieval Christian-Jewish polemics and the entanglements of pre-modern sexism, antisemitism, and racism. Kerstin completed their MA and BA at Vienna in Jewish Studies and Slavonic Studies, and since 2023, Kerstin has worked as a postdoctoral assistant at the University of Vienna's Department of Jewish Studies. Kerstin has held previous positions at the International Research Center for Cultural Studies in Vienna, at the University of St. Andrews, and at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And between 2017 and 2021, Kerstin worked as project assistant at the Department of Jewish Studies, also at the University of Vienna. Since 2010, Kerstin's published articles on a variety of topics, such as sources on Jewish history in the Holy Roman Empire and its successor states, constructing and experiencing Jewish identity, constructions of Jewish identity and alterity in Christian exemplar studies, and comprehending anti-Semitism throughout the ages. Kerstin is the co-editor of the series An End to Anti-Semitism, published in Berlin by de Gruyter from 2019 to 2021, and is a member of various work and study groups on gender history and religion and gender at the University of Vienna, the University of Erfurt, and Queen Mary University, London. Kerstin's research primarily focuses on Christian-Jewish relations and mechanisms of discrimination in pre-modern times, the conceptualization of the Jewish body, as well as genders and sexualities in Judaism. And Kerstin's talk today will challenge common conceptions and misconceptions about the idea of bleeding Jews in the Middle Ages, as well as medieval views on menstruation, anti-Semitism, and sexism. Kerstin will also expose scientific biases and gaps in contemporary research, demonstrating that there is more to Jewish male menstruation than a purely mystical or mythical side. Kerstin, thanks so much for joining us tonight. It's great to have you with us.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. So I'll start showing my screen again. Let's see if that works.
Mm-hmm.
Can you see that all right?
Yes, I can see that okay.
Okay, fine. Let's see if I can move it as well. Yes, fine.
Excellent.
Okay, so yeah. Again, thank you for inviting me. Also, thanks to Joao for reaching out to me in the first place. What I want to talk about today is Jewish male menstruation and the myth that's been created around it. Because like at nearly every conference on medieval anti-Semitism in particular, like this peculiar topic of Jewish male menstruation inevitably comes up. So often, but with a whisper and hesitant, did you know that? As though it's a secret or a strange taboo. So it seems that everybody has heard of this curious idea, but very few actually know where it comes from or what it really means. And this isn't surprising because like the myth of Jewish male menstruation only began attracting serious scholarly attention in the late 1990s. And even then it surfaced in just a handful of articles. And these early studies offered limited historical context and were often shaped by their own contemporary biases about race, about anti-Semitism, gender, sexuality, and especially about queer theory. So nevertheless, the notion that Jews, quote unquote, bled from their anuses in the Middle Ages has made its way into many fields, from studies on Jewish identity and medieval medicine to gender and race in medieval Europe. However, it rarely gets more than a brief mention, often as a sensational aside. A paragraph here or there to underscore the absurdity of medieval anti-Semitism or to highlight the perceived quote-unquote backwardness of medieval thought as a whole. This myth is often used to spark fascination and shock, rather than to explore what this strange claim actually reveals about medieval beliefs and prejudices and about those who fostered them. So unpacking the myth means looking closely at the historical context in which such ideas emerged and understanding how they reflect deeper anxieties about religion, identity, and the human body in medieval thought. There's more to this story than just its sensational surface, and examining it closely can shed light onto some of the hidden dynamics of medieval society. I personally first encountered the peculiar notions in one of those very settings. I heard and read a few publications that Jews supposedly bled regularly from their anuses and occasionally from their penises as part of a quote unquote specific form of sexual pathology, a topic that reportedly even intrigued Freud. According to various accounts, Jewish men in the Middle Ages bled either once a year on Good Friday, several times a year, or even monthly. Explanations for this bleeding varied widely. Some attributed it to hemorrhoids, others to a melancholic temperament, and some linked it to femininity, although not necessarily. Sometimes it was described as disease, but in other times it was considered something completely natural. But conspicuously absent from these discussions, however, was any consideration of whether there was any truth to these claims or what Jewish people of the time thought about these bizarre accusations. So my curiosity about these unanswered questions in particular and about the complexities behind them ultimately led me to pursue this topic for my PhD research. And today I'm going to give you a brief tour through what I found and did not find alongside this journey. You have here an overview of what I will be talking about today. So I started to dig, and the deeper I dug, the more frustrated I became with how the topic of Jewish male menstruation was approached, or rather ignored. The first article to focus specifically on Jewish male menstruation and to attempt tracing its origins labeled it a myth. This wasn't in a sense of a cultural creation story, but more as if it were an odd rumor, something strange and esoteric. Although the term Jewish male menstruation was used, the author framed the discussion almost entirely around Jewish blood guilt with barely any connection to menstruation itself. He overlooked the possibility of understanding the menstruating Jew within a broader context of intersecting discrimination that included religion, gender, and race. By defining Jewish male menstruation as a myth, the article obscured its sexist dimensions. Yet it still set the precedent as the first academic work on the topic, and future studies repeated and reinforced these first studies' limited framing. Its narrow interpretation, treating it solely as a myth of blood guilt, established a tradition of focusing only on certain aspects while leaving other equally significant contexts unexplored when talking about Jewish male menstruation. Subsequent studies, although scarce, discovered new sources and acknowledged that there was more to this peculiar claim, highlighting the, quote, convenient marriage of theological polemic and contemporary natural philosophy, a portrayal of the bleeding Jew as, quote, womanish, as well as the racialized side of the allegation. But interestingly, after but 4 cornerstone publications that appeared in the late 1990s and early 2000s, nobody has picked up the questions left open ever since. So in my dissertation, I expanded on earlier conclusions about the racial elements embedded in the accusation of Jewish male menstruation. However, unlike previous scholars, I argue that any claim of regular bleeding attributed to Jewish men is always profoundly gendered. Furthermore, I contend that these claims are deeply informed by menstruation as a religious cultural construct, one with complex symbolic meanings. So now let's examine Jewish male menstruation through these perspectives and uncover what the curious notion is truly about. I've already touched briefly on the fact that representations of Jewish male menstruation are varied and at times even contradictory. So let's look at some examples to see how diverse and complex these portrayals can be. So at first glance, many statements about bleeding Jewish men seem similar, yet they reveal significant differences upon closer examinations. The first 2 sources that you can see here, both from the early 13th century, disagree not only about the frequency of this so-called bloody flux, but also about its nature. The first source describes it as a monthly cycle. Quote, it says, quote, they have a flux of blood every month, but dismisses it as relatively minor, while the other source considered it a serious, quote, sickness that afflicts Jews annually on Good Friday. The 3 additional sources from the late 13th and early 14th centuries take a more scientific approach, applying humoral theory and tracing the source of the bleeding. And in one case, this source is identified as the penis, in the others it's located in the anus, so they differ here again. But these texts all conclude that the bloody flux is something naturally occurring in Jewish men. And some of them also connected to sinful behavior by referencing the so-called blood curse from the Gospel of Matthew, where the Jewish crowd present at the crucifixion allegedly accepted responsibility for Jesus's death. So that is what the middle source here says when he quotes Matthew 27:25, "Let his blood be upon us and on our children." So here we see theological and medical explanations that are not treated as mutually exclusive. And this connection becomes even clearer in the final source, which suggests that baptism and conversion are the ultimate cures for this supposed ailment. So a condition that he claims Jewish men have suffered since the time of Christ's death. So again, referencing the blood curse from the Gospel of Matthew, although implicitly here in this source. These very portraits of Jewish men and their supposed blood flows have long cast Jewish male menstruation as a sensational rumor, because apparently even in the Middle Ages, people weren't entirely sure what to make of the claim. But if we examine the context in which these texts were produced and consider their functions, a pattern starts to emerge, because there is in fact a system behind these differing accounts. The first two sources, if we go back to them again, are pastoral compositions aimed at illustrating Jewish sinfulness as a trait made visible in their bodies. The next three examples are drawn from medical treatises, which take on a scientific tone, yet they underscore the Jews' perceived transgression of both nature and nurture. So they suggest a reciprocal influence between physical and psychological deviance. And the final source is a Good Friday sermon that asserts that conversion to Christianity is the only escape from this cycle of bloody suffering. So despite their differences, each of these portrayals communicates a similar message: Jewish otherness, Jewish transgression, and inferiority. This theme is represented by Jewish bleeding as what I perceive of as a literary motif, a concept that encompasses various symbols, images, and tropes through repeated intra and intertextual references. It is usually brief, but carries symbolic weight. And this makes the term motif more accurate than myth for describing Jewish menstruation, because calling it a motif offers three key advantages. First, unlike myth, which can imply storytelling or cultural lore, motif is a fixed literary term, not subject to interpretative bias. Secondly, thinking in terms of motifs helps us to better analyze these texts by revealing their motivations and intentions. So it reminds us that we are interpreting what people wrote about the menstruating Jew, not what they might have actually believed. And finally, understanding Jewish male menstruation as a motif eliminates the need to stress its imaginary nature. Because while men throughout history may have experienced hemorrhoidal and penile bleeding due to illness, they have certainly never menstruated the way women do. And just as a heads up here, I use the term women here with the understanding that, of course, not all women menstruate and not all menstruators are women, but for the purpose of this historical analysis, we'll adhere to the period's terminology. So, but menstruation and all its cultural meanings, it's ultimately what this entire construct revolves around. And peculiarly, this is the one thing that most scientific explorations of the motif have consistently overlooked, even though it's the most obvious element. So I argue that the reason for this neglect lies in the centuries-old classification of menstruation as taboo and stigma, as something to be kept secret, concealed, and avoided in conversation. Every menstruator today is likely familiar with what has been called the concealment imperative. So the social forces that shape a menstruator's experience of menstruation, driving them into a state of menstrual shame and secrecy, often reinforced by the use of menstrual hygiene products particularly. The pressure to keep oneself clean and to hide one's period is the central imperative that governs the menstrual experience. This is a concept that our grandmothers would certainly recognize, but it remains deeply ingrained that even for my own millennial generation is hard to unlearn. Critical menstruation studies, therefore, and they have emerged over the past 20 years or so, advocate for putting menstruation at the center of attention. They argue that through taboo and stigma and through the concealment imperative, menstruation is foremost constructed as a health issue, conflation of biology and ideology that serves to restrict menstruator social participation. The seemingly unquestionable link between menstruation and femaleness then has in turn politicized menstruation. So using menstruation as a lens through which to examine religious, cultural, social, and political processes helps to uncover the power dynamics at play and exposes the key actors behind them. This approach is just as relevant when exploring the medieval accusation of Jewish male menstruation. So we have established Jewish male menstruation as a motif, and as such it is made up of various symbols, tropes, and images. And the motif, furthermore, appears in different forms or so-called motif strands. We can identify three main variants of the Jewish male menstruation motif. The strand number one connects the bleeding to a hemorrhoidal condition, an interpretation most clearly found in scientific texts, including medical textbooks and natural philosophical treatises. Among the first to initiate the scientific discussion of Jewish male menstruation as a shameful probe on the anuses was the physician and medical teacher Bernard de Gourdon, who claimed that Jews, quote, suffer an immoderate flow of blood from hemorrhoids. Although when we consider the medieval understanding of the human body, which was viewed as a container of humus that needed to be balanced or, when unbalanced, expelled, we can see how this hemorrhoidal flow was understood in ways similar to menstruation. Both were perceived as processes with purging qualities, ridding the body of excess humus and restoring health. The second variant of the motif that we encounter in our examples is a Jewish blood flow resembling menstruation, a condition that I refer to as quasi-menstrual. We see this in Jacques de Vidry's abbreviated history of Jerusalem, where he reports that he found the local Jews to be physically weak, more so than women, and suffering, quote, a flow of blood at every changing of the moon, thus meaning monthly. The connection to the moon reinforces Jacques' perception of this Jewish blood flow as quasi-menstrual, as the moon was believed to govern the menstrual cycle and the humus of women in general. Similarly, the moon was thought to make Jews unstable and wandering, sometimes irritable, sometimes deeply melancholic, traits often commonly associated with women as well. Finally, from the mid-14th century onwards, we find texts that explicitly use the term menstruation. Interestingly, these texts often attribute the flow to both Jewish women and men. One example is an anonymous Computus text from 1342, which has an extensive commentary tradition. The commentators repeatedly assert that, quote, among the Jews, both men and women suffer from a blood flow monthly. And Jewish men in particular, they say, are being watchful not to leave the house unless they are well armed with napkins and other things that help them hide this flux. So in this version of the commentary, the perception of Jewish male menstruation as deeply shameful and embarrassing for its sufferers is quite clear. Much like women who have long navigated the concealment imperative, Jews are portrayed as making a concerted effort to contain and hide their blood flow, using medieval equivalents of sanitary pads. Representations of the Jewish flux in these texts are therefore nothing short of menstrual, and this is the third of the three motif strands. So while this last strand is the most definitive, I argue that all representations of Jewish blood flow are intricately tied to menstruation, as well as to religious, cultural, and socio-political implications of the menstrual cycle. As a preeminent symbol of God-given life, menstruation holds a unique position, even within a culture that is deeply concerned with blood, like Judeo-Christian medieval Europe. Blood plays a central role in constituting the body, ensuring its vitality and defining its boundaries. Both the individual and the communal body are imagined as containers that can appear either closed and whole or broken and open, especially in relation to blood, which ensures bodily integrity, while its loss can spell injury or even death. Menstruation is unique in that it allows the body to bleed regularly, to be broken continually without the same threats of harm. Furthermore, menstruation was seen as a mark of distinction between men and women. The theological roots of the menstrual cycle inflicted upon the first woman, who we know as Eve, after her transgression in Eden, led to an association between menstruation, sin, and punishment. Eve's curse eventually became a curse for all women, linking them to spiritual, mental, and physical weakness, as well as to a sense of uncontrollability that required constant surveillance. The typology of Eve as the archetypal female served as a basis for the creation of a typological figure of the Jew, uncontrolled, weak, and, echoing in the concept of Jewish male menstruation, even of corrupted gender identity. Early medieval medicine acknowledged the role of menstruation in both conception and health. Menstruators were considered too weak to digest food properly and, as a result, needed regular purging. But that process was not viewed as pathological, but rather as necessary for maintaining balance. However, there was a qualitative distinction between those who were well-balanced and those who were not. And unfortunately, both women and Jews were perceived as naturally unbalanced. So the late Middle Ages in particular saw an increasing pathologization of menstruation alongside misogynistic perceptions of the menstrual cycle that regularly depicted menstruators as hysterical, wanton, and mad creatures. So overall, as threats to society when left uncontrolled. And similar accusations were leveled against Jews, reinforcing their growing economic, political, and social discrimination, and ultimately justifying physical persecution across Europe. Jewish male menstruation was one of these accusations, playing a significant role, particularly, for example, on the Iberian Peninsula during the Inquisition trials. But Jewish blood flows, much like menstruation here, but not only on the Iberian Peninsula, symbolized inferiority that was inscribed in the body and could not be changed. The motif of Jewish male menstruation is thus a mixture of the prejudices and anxieties of the time, all tied up in ideas about identity and social roles. Even today, menstruation is shaped by culture and linked to ideas of gender and racial identity. The menstruating Jew falls into multiple categories at once. His bleeding placed him in an unclear gender space, somewhere between healthy and diseased, and in a sort of legal gray area, caught between inclusion and exclusion from society. And I would argue that Jewish male menstruators can actually thus be seen as queer, challenging the rigid boundaries between male and female, between healthy and sick, between Christian and Jew, because talking about the Iberian Peninsula Inquisition trials, it was much more a question of what if Jews converted, would they still bleed or not? And so ultimately a distinction between good and bad. The way Jewish male menstruation was connected to sin and impurity meant it could be easily associated with otherness, with inferiority, and with transgression. This association was not just a matter of biology or folklore, it was about power, control, and the way society defined itself in opposition to those it sought to marginalize. So if we have uncovered all these threads that bind the motif of Jewish male menstruation, we can now understand not only how it was fashioned to convey a particular meaning, but also how it was strategically employed. The menstruating Jew most often appears in the context of blood libels, including accusations of child murder and host desecration. Among the most famous of these stories are the stories of Little Hugh of Lincoln, of William of Norwich, and Simon of Trent, all of which accuse Jews not only of killing Christian boys, but also of using their blood for the treatment of their supposed bloody ailments, including Jewish male menstruation. Another example can be found in a trial record from early modern Trnava, which is modern-day Trnava in Slovakia. Here, the Jews were accused of murdering, quote, a Christian youth of high rank. And in the report of the event, the motivations for this murder are tied to what was perceived as the Jews' peculiar behavior. Their sacrificial practices, love magic, circumcision, consumption of blood, and its supposed use in curing their affliction with menstruation. While accusations of blood collection were a standard prerequisite for trials against Jews, by the 14th and 15th centuries, such reports had undergone a significant transformation. Earlier accounts, such as those that I mentioned of Hugh and William, focused on the victim, elevating them to a martyr status, much like Christ on the cross. Over time, however, these stories expanded into more general claims about the regularity and universality of such events, reinforcing the notion that this was a perpetual and ongoing threat. So what was once an isolated incident could now be framed as a continuous systematic problem. This shift allowed the accusation of murder to be elevated into an allegation of regular homicide, which further reinforced the idea that Jews were inherently transgressive. They flouted social, cultural, and religious borders. It fostered superstition and mistrust and set the stage for violent acts against Jewish communities. So if we look again at the Turnau example, we see that this report reflects this shift perfectly. So it emphasizes the gravity of the Jews' supposed transgression. It reinforces disgust at the perceived deviant and queer sexuality and gender identity, and so fosters mistrust. And this new wave of accusations then led to another inquisitional trial, which culminated ultimately in the execution of several Jews from Turnau in the 16th century, and to the expulsion of the entire Jewish community from the city. So the strategic use of the motif can be observed perfectly from this example, but we see it also in texts from Reformation Germany, where Jewish male menstruation was employed to reinforce individual and communal identities, as well as notions of otherness. In 16th century Germany, identity was deeply influenced by religious confession. And in this context, the motif of Jewish male menstruation took a new significance within interreligious polemics. So firstly, we see that we are here dealing with polemics between Christians and Jews, and now the motif enters interreligious polemics where Catholics are in debate with Reform Christians. These debates, they expanded beyond the earlier intention of merely denigrating Jewish masculinity, and instead now focused on issues of true belief and of true doctrine, where religious identity was being negotiated through discussions about Jewish rituals and customs, as both Catholics and Reformers sought to assert the superiority of their respective faiths. Catholics, they were eager to expose the secret practices of the Jews, and so painted them as the antithesis of Christian values, accusing them of hatred for all things Christian and seeking to reveal their true identity. That's why the motif of Jewish male menstruation is so often employed in their polemics against Reform Christianity. The Reformers, on the other hand, such as Andreas Osiander, turned the tables by accusing Catholics of believing in absurd superstitions. Osiander famously challenged the belief that Jews suffered from regular blood flows and used Christian children's blood as cure, when he bluntly stated, quote, "These are obvious lies," and pointed out that no one had ever actually witnessed a Jewish man menstruate. He challenged, quote, "For show me one Jew free of suspicion who has the flow of blood." By doing so, Osiander and others debunked not only the myth of Jewish blood rituals, but also laid bare the underlying mechanisms of Catholic blood libels in particular. These accusations, when subjected to logical scrutiny, fell apart. There was simply no empirical evidence to support the notion of Jewish male menstruation. However, the lack of proof did not diminish the power of the accusation. It became a form of social control, a tool to police boundaries, enforce fear, and perpetuate division. Accusing Jews of this bodily peculiarity tapped into deeper fears about social cohesion and the fear of sameness, the blurring of religious, social, and gender norms. The binary distinction between superior and inferior had to remain intact, and this was not true not just for the division between Jews and Christians, but also between, as we see in this example, Catholics who believed in blood libels and Reformed Christians who found these beliefs absurd. So ultimately, this all reinforced the rigid distinction between men and women, as well as between different social and religious groups, ensuring that these boundaries could not be crossed without consequence. What then can we conclude? Firstly, that the notion of the Jewish blood flow likely originated from the blood curves in the Gospel of Matthew, but it quickly gained traction due to its association with menstruation. The materiality of menstrual blood made the accusation awful, suggesting authority related to blood as a powerful metaphorical symbol, but given menstrual blood's particular nature, signified shame and disgust. Despite being a fabrication with no empirical grounding, the motif's material and symbolic potency ensured its persistence and vitality within the collective imagination. And I argue that it does until today, when we remember where we started with people always bringing up the idea in every single conversations that you have about medieval anti-Semitism. My second conclusion is, of course, that if we focus the analysis on menstruation, that erases any doubt that the motif is both gendered and racialized. Establishing a qualitative difference between those who menstruate, women and Jewish men, and those who do not is clearly sexist, and misogynistic assumptions are layered on top. Similarly, creating a hierarchy between normative Christian masculinity and allegedly Jewish corrupted masculinity reflected in the supposed bleeding of Jewish men is overtly anti-Semitic in a racial sense. These two aspects are inseparable from the motif, and previous studies that have overlooked them have, I argue, done so with intentional selectivity. And finally, I hope to have shown through the strategic uses of the motif that Jewish male menstruation was far more than a myth or rumor. For medieval thinkers, menstruation destabilized the notion of bodily integrity. Menstruating bodies, whether women or also supposedly Jewish men, posed a challenge to the social order. Both stood as counter-images to an idealized form of hegemonic masculinity, and therefore were subjected to invisibility, stigmatization, and control. These portrayals of Jewish men and women as deviant were products of anxiety, conjured by those who sought to define and defend societal norms. So when we, as scholars, continue to dismiss Jewish male menstruation as just a myth, or refer to it only in hushed conference whispers or sensational footnotes, we unwittingly tread in the footsteps of medieval thinkers. We risk reinforcing a concealment imperative, not only around menstruation, but also around the uncomfortable legacies of pre-modern sexism, racism, and anti-Semitism. By conveniently relegating such complex issues to supposedly unenlightened Middle Ages full of dark superstition, we avoid reckoning with the deeper mechanisms of prejudice and marginalization that remain relevant even today. So if we truly aim to understand how groups such as Jews, women, and queer people living and challenging the proposed gender binary have been systematically othered and shunned, we must face these uncomfortable histories directly. Acknowledging these layered realities gives us the clarity needed to critique and dismantle enduring structures of discriminations. Thank you.
Kerstin, thank you so much. That was a really fascinating talk. I think certainly a much needed revision of this topic. Yeah, and I think a really interesting way to, I suppose, expand the way that we discuss the topics of menstruation and other kind of similar things in medieval studies and beyond. So thank you very much. That was really interesting.
Thank you.
I wanted to
Should I
start. Oh,
stop
sorry.
sharing my screen, or do we want to go back to something? Do you want to go back to something?
I suppose we can maybe keep it there for now, just in
Okay.
case you want to kind of jump back during the Q&A. Or equally, if you want to just kind of just put it to one side, that's fine as well. Good stuff. So I wanted to firstly ask a bit about the historiography around this topic, and it seems like from what you said, it's like a very skewed curve that we have, where sort of it comes onto the scene in the 1990s, or it gets sort of mentioned tangentially. It then seems to sort of lose interest kind of in the 2000s. And if and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems that it's only now recently starting to be picked up again in recent years. Yeah, and that seems very unusual. One would expect most historiography to kind of have a fairly kind of steady stream of interest. So why do you think there has been this sort of very unusual kind of spike in interest in recent years.
Well, I think we see two things at play here. The first one is with the first publications that we have from the 1990s and early noughties, the problem is that like they pick it up, they make something of it, and then they dismiss it again. And it seems like the reception of these first studies was a bit of the same. Like everybody took it in. We're like, okay, now we know what it's all about, but there's not much more to say about this. And then it continues with people taking up these studies to use them for their own investigations, say of Shakespeare's works, where you have the odd Jew bleeding. Like if you remember like this like the famous quote, like if you prick me, do I not bleed? So it comes up here and there, but it's never really investigated. And then of course we see the other like the other side of the pendulum is that now with critical menstruation studies and menstruation per se having kind of a moment, and is now having a moment now since I'd say for 5 years now or so, there's more interest again. But the interesting thing is still people are less interested in what it's actually about, but they still adhere to this like sensational aura that the topic carries. So like, for example, at the IMC this year, I had someone ask, like directly approach me and try to argue about whether or not this was true and whether I had like approached this from a particular, if I didn't have like a similar bias that I try to expose, but from another kind of angle, like if I was not being anachronistic with applying modern research such as critical menstruation studies or critical race studies. So there's an aura of like still trying to keep this topic like hushed and shushed and not really exposed and explored in all its complexity.
Hmm. Absolutely. And it does seem a pity that that seems to be the case. It's almost sort of something that I can imagine that, scholars might, just kind of discuss, almost as you say, like a sensational thing at conferences without kind of properly examining it. So I think this is why, it's so important, certainly in my opinion, the research that you're currently doing. And yeah, interesting that you sort of mentioned that there was this kind of discussion about kind of applying modern ideas of intersectionality back to medieval studies. And yeah, I suppose I'm curious. To those that do have reservations about that, kind of what would you say to kind of how we can apply sort of intersectional ideas to medieval studies?
Well, I think often people are just unfamiliar or uncomfortable with using modern terminology to look at all the material. Because often, like especially with the discussion about anti-Semitism in particular or racism again, it's more about or like whether we can use a term that has such a fixed meaning and is so associated with a particular historical period, such as like racism is so associated with the transatlantic slave trade that we are hesitant to apply a similar terminology to studies that date before that time. But I think like by trying to obscure or trying to avoid this terminology, we make things worse even because like we cannot talk about things that we cannot actually name. And it is now like we have all these things now. There is critical race theory applied for medieval studies. There's queer studies, there's trans studies. So it's clear that all of these things that we see now in our modern day life, they've always been there. Ideas of race, ideas of gender, ideas of genders outside the idealized binary have always been there. So why not address them? It's just, I think we have to be careful not to like get taken away with all too modern theories and all like we should try not to project back our own ideas into old material, but that's not to say that we cannot work with theories to expose mechanisms of identity formation, mechanisms of discrimination in all the material as well by using these modern theories, if you like to call them modern.
Absolutely. And I couldn't agree more. Like that stuff's always been there. We can absolutely approach it in that way. Yeah, and I'd be interested, kind of, how did you find kind of approaching the primary material for this topic? And were there any challenges that you encountered with the sources that you have looked through?
Well, finding the sources was quite difficult because like you're not really sure what you're looking for, especially if you have all these different variants of the same motif. So you would have sources that would talk about hemorrhoidal bleeding, but you could never be sure whether this was actually about that. So like finding the sources was kind of an approach like a snowball effect. So one source led me to another one when they quoted one another, when they like interfered with one another, so to speak, because most of the sources are created in a very like at the same time, so to speak, in different parts of Europe. So that was one challenge, like where to like to follow the path that the sources would guide me on. That was a bit difficult. And then trying to, when writing things up, I continuously lacked like sort of like a third level where I had this like two-dimensional surface, but I had to like, but I always thought of it like I needed a next level in order to approach all these things from different angles, because like what I did then eventually was approaching it through genre types of the sources, but I could also have approached it from different angles. So that was something that was complicated as well, because I was working with so many sources, because I was trying to draw a discursive history. So not working with one or two sources and doing a close reading on them, but instead of like working with 30 and more sources, just posed difficulties in ways of how you approach and work with your material.
Definitely, I can well imagine. And I do think that kind of in the kind of building of your theory, I think one thing that's really interesting is how you could develop this idea of the literary motif and how it links to Jewish menstruation. And I'd be interested in kind of what was the sort of, how did you sort of develop that into your theory? Kind of what was the kind of thought process of kind of weaving that in?
I think like it became clear to me early on that all of these different variants and different images and different representations all tied to menstruation. And that was my initial claim. And then like the next step was just finding a way of how to connect all of these. And then the literary motif theory came in handy because like it's something that is, as I said, like it's a fixed term, it's a fixed definition of what a motif is. And that was very easy then for me to avoid all the other discussions, but like especially where we often, again, like terminology is a problem. We throw around terms like myth, motif, trope, narrative here and there, with like the literary historian would freak at us and be like, no, we have definitions for here. You can't call everything a trope or whatever. So
Yeah.
that was something that was helpful to have one term with a fixed definition and then work with that.
Yeah, definitely. And then it certainly seemed from your presentation that it just seems to sort of encapsulate what's going on here. Like so well, as you say, it's this sort of idea that, clearly it is a sort of it's a trope, so to speak. Apologies to any literary historians who are listening in. But it seems to be one of those things that clearly has a kind of motif behind it, sort of an agenda behind it. And then it clearly is kind of within this kind of setting where all these different ideas of kind of race and gender seem to kind of intermesh.
Yeah. And especially with these sources from the early modern period, you could see that now, like, as I said, it gets strategically employed. It's no longer about like the actual content. So in all of these, like the Reformation Germany sources, or also I mentioned the Iberian Peninsula, it's less about the actual idea whether Jews really menstruated, something that we find in the medical treatises, for example, where they go on and on and on and try to find reasons for why Jews would suffer such bleeding. So that is no longer of interest starting from the 1400s onwards. So it's a fixed thing that gets employed and everybody supposedly knows the contents of it and the themes that it conveys. So that was also like looking at the early modern sources first led me to thinking that the motif could work, especially for the older sources that are still very diverse.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. And I'd be intrigued, like, do you find that there's a kind of point where you can kind of see where it kind of moves from being some in the kind of medieval sense to that more sort of early modern strategic use? Or is it more of a kind of gradual change that you see?
I think that differs depending on where we look at. So it's the context on the Iberian Peninsula is definitely something very, very specific that I also had to exclude from my PhD because there's so much else going on the Iberian Peninsula in this time. But I'd say in Europe by the 1400s, there is no longer a lot of discussion about the very issue. So it's just like the mentions of the motif, or like the mentions, the portrayals of Jewish bleeding men, they get briefer. It's really just thrown into a text without much further ado. So the one source that I showed from is from medieval early modern Denmark, which then absolutely doesn't make any sense to include such a motif in a sermon in Denmark, given that there was no Jewish community in Denmark even before the 1700s. So it's quite clear that it's no longer about the content, but it's just a motif that is used to symbolize something different. In this case of Denmark, it's about disbelief within the Christian community, where the Jewish disbelievers and doubters function as a symbol for intercommunal disbelief and doubt. So, but we see that around the 1400s, that it's no longer of interest really to discuss the actual fact of menstruation, of Jewish male menstruation, but rather than use it strategically. But then interestingly, after I'd say the 17th century, sources get very, very scarce, and then the motif disappears entirely. And I couldn't, until today, I don't have an idea why this happens, or I couldn't quite find anything to convince me, to give me a convincing answer why this happens, why all of a sudden the motif is no longer there, where other motifs of Christian anti-Semitism that came up in the Middle Ages or gained traction in the Middle Ages are very much present even until today, say well poisoning, say the Jewish nose or something like that, but Jewish male menstruation is gone.
Yeah, that's interesting stuff. And I suppose going back to the start of the period, we see that some of the texts kind of draw from kind of the 1200s and thereabouts. Is there a sort of particular reason why this notion starts to appear around about this period? Is there anything that you found at all in your research for that?
Well, that connects a lot with what's going on in the 1200s in total, or with like the turn of the 11th and 12th centuries, where blood piety in Christianity gains traction, or there's a lot more devotion to the body of Christ, to Christ's blood. And also another factor is that a mendicant preaching comes up. So the first larger texts that work on the motif or with the motif, they all come from Dominican Cistercian backgrounds, so monastic, mendicant monastic backgrounds, where the motif is used to spark sensation, to spark mistrust. And so blood piety on the one hand, and then lay preaching from mendicant backgrounds on the other hand, make it like they form the basis for the motif to emerge, really.
I see. And is that perhaps kind of how the trope sort of spreads across Europe, or are there kind of other factors at play there?
Yeah. Initially, of course, because like you see with the example, for example, from Caesarius of Heisterbach, who's a Cistercian, and it's also with the example from Denmark that I mentioned. They are all Cistercians or Dominicans copying each other or learning from each other, or trying to like emulate what their so-called forefathers did, and taking up things that they learned about during their own education, so to speak. So that is really like the mendicant friars are sort of to blame for the transmission of the motif throughout Europe. Then, of course, again with the physicians. So I mentioned Bernard de Gordon, who was really influential. So his textbooks were widely used all around, like Vienna University at the time, Paris University at the time, various universities in Italy as well. And of course, he also had a Dominican background, because like we must not forget that like physicians at the time, natural philosophers at the time, they all had theological training as well. So that's why I said also like natural, philosophical, medical, and theological explanations are not mutually exclusive, even if they sound like this for our modern ear. They are absolutely not.
Absolutely. And it does seem that they're completely interconnected. And it's all kind of part of a kind of wider discourse that plays into that. Absolutely. And one thing I think that was very sobering was to hear about the blood libel towards the end of your talk, and the fact that this trope did have very real consequences for Jews living in Europe. And I'll be interested to maybe explore that a bit more. Are there any other instances that you found where this trope has had consequences for Jewish communities at the time?
Well, I'd say not as directly as the example that I gave with Turnau in Slovakia, in modern-day Slovakia. Of course, you can say that many of the expulsions from German cities, they are connected to blood libels as well, but not necessarily every blood libel features Jewish male menstruation. There are often other accusations of like Jews collecting blood in order to put them into matzot, so the bread that they have to eat for Pesach, or host desecrations. So these are all factors that then cause mistrust, disgust, and hatred, and then ultimately lead to physical persecution and expulsions from cities. So we know that from 13th century Pforzheim, for example, 13th century Würzburg. But like that Jewish male menstruations is among these accusations is nowhere as clear as in the example that I gave. Apart from then, if you look to the Iberian Peninsula again, we have a lot of trial records where Jewish male menstruation is present as like a supposed proof for an enduring Jewishness that can't be eradicated even after baptism and conversion to Christianity.
I see. I see. Yeah, and one thing I'd also be interested to hear about is, were there any sort of Jewish voices kind of in this discussion? As I appreciate that primarily we're hearing sort of the discussions of kind of Christian scholars talking about the Jewish community. But yeah, were there any kind of responses to this kind of anti-Semitic idea from the Jewish community itself or from Jewish scholars?
Surprisingly, there's hardly any. So I found one, which is a translation, like a Hebrew translation of Bernard de Gordon's textbook, where the Hebrew Jewish translator translates the entire thing as Bernard has it, with mentioning sinfulness, punishment, suffering, illness, hemorrhoids. He translates everything like word by word, but then adds a gloss saying this is nonsense and whoever believes this is a liar or something like that. And that is really the only thing that I could find. So I assume that the lack of reaction is also says something. Like if someone keeps silent about something, that could also mean like they're like this could be a way of like dismissing the thing. Like it's not even worth to talk about it for us because like we know that this is a Christian fantasy that they increasingly use to accuse one another of like who's the better Christian and like who's the better believer. And like we as Jews, we don't even want to enter this discussion because like we know it's nonsense and let their fantasies be their fantasies, sort of.
Yeah,
I mean, of course, we have very little record also of what Jews experience during physical persecution, during all of these things that happen. So, of course, there must have been something that the Jews knew about that. Maybe not necessarily this motif in particular, but they must have been aware of accusations such as this one. But we have very little reactions in total from this period, specifically when we talk about like reactions to expulsions.
Absolutely. And I can well imagine that that's sort of quite difficult source material to kind of get a grasp of. Yeah. And I think absolutely. I suppose moving to the kind of final parts of your discussion, I think one thing that really resonated with me was this need not to kind of continue with the kind of not to kind of allow these sort of notions created by sort of the notion of Jewish male menstruation to continue to be part of kind of academic discussions around menstruation and associated topics. I think it's a really vital point that you touched on. And I'd be interested to know, do you think that there are any broader lessons that you feel that the academic community should be taking note of with regards to these particular topics?
Well, I think overall that we should not like shy away from using modern theory, modern terminology, and explore mechanisms of discrimination, historical discriminations, by making them legible and visible again and again, so that we understand what happened then, so that we can learn from what is happening now, and so that we can possibly like combat it at best, or at least like address it and explain people what's happening. That is the one thing. And the other thing is, especially with topics like menstruation in this sense, like I'd say either you approach it as a serious topic, or you don't. Because there's nothing like, it's not helpful if you approach something, but not like try to dismiss it while you approach it. There's nothing against like trying to disprove something that previous research did or did not, or even trying to disprove that something was a disbelief or wrong or whatever, a fantasy, an imagination, a narrative in the medieval period. But it's just like, don't, and that is something that I see in particular with this previous research, that like, especially because there was such a tie to menstruation, it was approached as a topic of lesser interest. But then again, they all use menstruation in their titles of their articles in order to gain, like, to gain interest and to even spark fascination or whatever. So that is a peculiar combination that I see as problematic.
And I'd agree. Like it's, I think it is very harmful and sort of problematic to kind of, use it in that kind of very sensationalist way, without sort of wanting to kind of candidly discuss it in an inclusive way.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And out of interest, are there any particular areas that you'd like to explore further as your research develops?
Well, right now I'm trying to leave the context of medieval anti-Semitism a bit, because like I have training in Jewish studies, so I want to go back to working with Jewish studies more. But of course, like the entire menstruation thing keeps me going, so I'm working now on historical perceptions and constructions of menstruation within Jewish thought, and that connects to also like constructions of the womb in Jewish thought. So that is what I'm working more towards now, because just I've had enough of Christian medieval anti-Semitism. I mean, I still think that we need to, and of course, like in times like these, also we as Jewish studies scholars, we are faced with a lot of difficulties and a lot of like need to educate people again and again. So there's no way you can leave this topic entirely, but it's just like, I feel like I've had enough of Christian anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages for a while, so I need to shift my focus away a bit. But it's certainly a fascinating topic that I will continue to explore. So even like the question about why does the motif disappear at one point, that is a question that like drives me insane, and I want to know why. So that I see a potential in the future to go back to the topic again and try to see what's still there.
Definitely, definitely. And if our listeners would like to learn more about this topic, or any of the kind of themes that we've discussed, where would you suggest that they go to kind of get an introductory kind of reading about it?
Well, it's a bit difficult because as I said, even the more modern material that is there is quite dispersed, and there's nothing comprehensive yet, because my book is yet to be published. But I'd say like I would of course recommend everyone to read my book once it's published. Yeah, and hopefully then draw their own conclusions or ask their own questions starting from there, because there's so much material left to be looked at. So I would love more people to explore this topic, and so that I could still learn, or even like find more sources, approach them from different angles. So people have approached. So I have even, especially like a colleague in Vienna, she did a PhD on the Iberian Peninsula and notions of difference and otherness, embodied otherness, and she explored the menstruation, Jewish male menstruation motif in Iberia. So there's so much more that we can still do, and I would encourage people to do so.
Absolutely, and I'll definitely echo that. Certainly a call to action to anybody who's looking for research topics or is kind of a researcher in this field. And of course, for everybody listening as well, do watch this space for Kerstin's book once it's published. Good stuff. I'm afraid that brings us to the end of our discussion, which is a real pity, as I think there's so much more that we can kind of unpack with this topic. But Kerstin, thank you so much. This has been a really fantastic discussion.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you again for having me. It was very nice to talk to you.
Thank you. And thanks very much, everybody, for listening as well. We hope that you'll join us for the next episode. Until then, take care.